I advise you, pray to the dice for mercy, for I assure you, the storyteller has none to spare. Today, we're going to talk about the Cleric in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Greetings, travelers and tourists. Welcome to my channel where we talk about role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. My name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who unfortunately has to tell you that the last person to like this video and subscribe to the channel is going to have to roll up a cleric because everybody else already made their character. I'm sorry, that's just the way it worked out. Today we are going to be continuing my classic introduction series where we talk about different classes inside of fantasy RPGs and ask what they have to offer players inside of our games. We're working through the classes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and in particular we have been talking about the foremost iconic character classes or character concepts in fantasy RPGs of all time. We've already talked about the fighter and the rogue, and today we're going to be talking about the cleric class. Long pigeonholed into being the default healer for any fantasy RPG party, we want to ask ourselves, do these holy men and women have anything more to offer the party, or are they just stuck being heal bots for a team of much more interesting characters at our gaming tables? What does the cleric have to offer? In this series, we are examining each class through 5 specific questions. First, we're talking about what is the cleric. Second, we want to ask what are the strengths of the cleric. Third, we want to ask what are the weaknesses of the cleric. Fourth, we want to talk about what builds the cleric has to offer players in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And last but certainly not least, we want to ask how can I get the most out of the cleric at my gaming table. So, join me for this discussion of the cleric inside Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Let's get started. Now really quick, I just want to say that the Star Wars shirt is actually a very appropriate choice for today's topic because clerics find your lack of faith disturbing. Clerics are the representatives of deities of different faiths inside your campaign world. And that word cleric actually relates to a real-world position that you and I are probably familiar with. Cleric is actually the singular of the word clergy. So when you think about clergy, men and women of the cloth in the real world, it's kind of the same concept. Representatives of the faith. When you think about priests and pastors, missionaries, nuns and chaplains, these different individuals who serve the church and serve the community, those are the clergy, and it's kind of the same thing inside of the game. Clerics are representatives of their faith, of their church. They are the speakers of heaven, or for darker concepts, maybe the heralds of Hades. Clerics, at their core, are men and women of faith. And I know that may seem like a strange tangent to start this video on, but I want you to keep those concepts in mind, because when we start talking about building a cleric in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, how to build a cleric well, those concepts can actually be really good inspiration for the characters that we might want to play. So just keep those concepts in the back of your mind because we will get back to them. Let's go ahead and talk about the first question today, which is, what is the cleric? When we talk about the cleric in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, what are we discussing? What is the role of the cleric? And if you want to use game terminology to answer that question, simply speaking, the cleric is a prepared divine tradition spellcaster. That is exactly what you're playing. Now, if you're not really familiar with Pathfinder 2nd Edition terminology, those words might not mean much to you yet, so let's break it down a little bit. This question of what is the cleric, we actually break that down into 3 subcategories, if you will. What is the class role? how complex is the class to play, and what are the key ideas or terminology that you need to be familiar with in order to play a cleric well at your gaming table. Now, looking at those three different categories, I want to start by talking about the complexity of the cleric. I give the cleric an overall complexity rating of 5 out of 10. It is about average for me in terms of how complex classes can be in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, on one hand, the cleric is a spellcasting class, and spellcasting classes are, by default, more complex than non-spellcasting classes. Spellcasting tends to be something of an involved rule set in any game system, and honestly, it's true for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. If you're going to play a spellcaster, you're going to be looking at a class that is a little bit more complex on average than other classes inside the game. But even though the cleric is a spellcasting class, in my personal opinion, the cleric is actually the least complex of the spellcasting classes. We'll get into some of the details later about why I say that, but for now I just want to say of the various spellcasters you can play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, cleric is probably one of the easier classes, one of the more approachable classes inside of the game. So, even though clerics are a spellcasting class, I think that overall I'm comfortable giving them a complexity rating of 5 out of 10 because I feel like they're one of the more manageable classes when it comes to complexity, especially for new players. Now, I give this caveat in every video in this series, and I'll go ahead and throw it in here again. Don't let these complexity ratings push you away from any class inside the game. In my experience, if you are interested in playing a particular type of character, the interest and the excitement that surrounds playing that style of character is going to more than make up for any complexity in trying to play that character. Excitement always trumps complexity, so if you are interested in a class or if you are interested in a concept, go ahead and give it a shot. Even if you're a brand new player, I guarantee you, if you're interested, you will be able to make do when it comes to the class. But still, in discussing the complexity of the cleric, that concept of spellcasting is actually where a lot of the complexity is going to come from. That's where most of our conversation needs to be. If we want to understand what the cleric is, we have to understand how the cleric's spellcasting works. So, to do that, we get to break it down a little bit further. We get to talk about how the clerics cast spells. We get to talk about what kind of spells clerics cast. We also get to discuss what list of spells clerics have access to. Another concept is how spells are categorized. And then finally, you want to talk about how spells are modified inside of the game. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, but we'll go through it pretty quickly here. Up first, clerics are prepared spellcasters. Spellcasters come in two varieties here, prepared versus spontaneous. That designation of prepared versus spontaneous really is going to tell you where you have flexibility as a spellcaster. Spontaneous spellcasters have more flexibility in using their spells, but prepared spellcasters have more flexibility in accessing or selecting their spells. Clerics are prepared spellcasters, and that means that at the start of the day, clerics actually spend time preparing which spells they want to use during a given day. So they set aside some time for prayer, for ritual, for devotion, whatever it may be, and they select, before the adventure ever begins, what spells they want to have at the ready. Do they want offensive spells? Do they want defensive spells? Do they want to buff their allies? Do they want to imbue magic into their weapons? Before the day begins, the cleric sits down and decides what magic they want to have at the ready. The flexibility of the cleric is found when they prepare their spells, and so that designation of prepared spellcaster is one of the things we want to have in mind. Up next, we want to ask, what type of magic do clerics cast? Now, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there is a metagame term called magic essences. In terms of mechanics of play, you will probably never use this terminology, but when you think about the metagame of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that's when essences become important. There are 4 essences in Pathfinder 2nd Edition: mental, spiritual, matter, and life. Every tradition of magic in Pathfinder 2nd Edition takes 2 of these 4 essences and combines them to create a unique spell list. Clerics in specific use the spiritual and life essence. Spiritual magic is magic that deals with the soul, and life magic is, well, magic that deals with life and death. So when you think about the cleric and the metagame of what magic a cleric is going to bring to the table, they're going to be bringing magic that affects typically the soul or the body of their allies or possibly their enemies. So when you take those 2 essences and stick them together, you get the divine magic tradition, which is the spell list for the cleric. There are 4 different traditions inside of the game: arcane, divine, occult, and primal, and clerics serve as the standard bearer for what the divine magic tradition is in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, one thing we're not going to dive too deeply into, at least at the moment, is the concept of spell schools, which is how magic is actually classified inside of the game. There are 8 different schools of magic: abjuration, conjuration, divination, evocation, enchantment, illusion, necromancy, and transmutation. And each of those categories is used to kind of define what effects a spell has. But when you're talking about the metagame of the cleric, we really don't need to know a lot about that yet, so we'll save some of that conversation for later. And that brings us to the last thing that we need to talk about, which is how do you modify magic inside of the game? Spells are cool, but if you're anything like me, you want to play around with your spells. You want to change them up. You want to do different things with them. And there is terminology for that inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, which is the meta magic keyword. Ha! We got to keywords, finally. Every class inside the game comes with a handy chart that tells us what keywords or terminology we need to be aware of, and this is the big one for spellcasters and therefore for clerics. That is metamagic. Metamagic are special actions that you can take to modify the parameters of spells that you cast. So, as a cleric, you will have options in the game that are labeled metamagic that you can take, and then when you go to cast a spell, you can add an action to that spell to change how the spell functions. Now, I know that was a ton of stuff about magic, but before we leave the key terminology of the cleric, there is one more thing I want to talk about, and that is anathema and edicts. Now, these are 2 things that have been part of fantasy RPGs for a while, but Pathfinder 2nd Edition is the first game that has really codified what these things are and what they mean at the gaming table. Anathema and edicts are basically your character's morality system, and for certain classes in the game, your character's morality is extremely important. And, well, let's be honest, for the representatives of faiths and gods, these are going to be big ideas. Edicts are the things that your deity or that your faith expects you to do. This is the to-do list. This is the checklist of things you need to be actively accomplishing. And anathema are the things that are out of bounds for a member of a particular faith. So, as a cleric, you're going to have a list of edicts and anathema that come from your deity that impact what actions you can use inside of the game. Technically, the cleric list of key terms doesn't include edicts and anathema, but I consider those to be a pretty important idea for the class, so it's something I want you to be aware of. So, now that we've dug through all of that, let's go back and talk about the role of the cleric in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, which is, as we said earlier, a prepared, divine tradition spellcaster. We understand what those terms mean a little bit better now, but let's let's go ahead and kind of talk about the metagame of all of this. The cleric is probably best described as a defensive spellcaster. They are a spellcasting class that is going to focus on protecting themselves, protecting their allies, buffing themselves, buffing their allies, and yes, as the old stereotype of the cleric goes, also throwing out plenty of heals to keep the party standing. If you are looking for a spellcasting class that brings a lot of defensive options to the table, Cleric may be the class for you. Now that's a pretty good big picture of what the Cleric is, but let's go ahead and move on to our second big question of the video, which is, what are the strengths of the Cleric? And I guess we'll start with the most significant strength of the Cleric, necromancy. Wait, what? Okay, yes, necromancy is listed as the primary strength of the cleric. Let's talk about this for a second. If you're like me, you've always heard the term necromancy used in context of like zombies and skeletons and kill spells inside of fantasy RPGs. Why would I label the healer class as the strongest necromancy class inside of the game? Well, for a long time, necromancy in fantasy RPGs has been codified as the magic of life and death. And for a really long time, the emphasis has been on the and death. But there has been a debate inside of games about if necromancy is the school of life and death, shouldn't healing magic qualify as necromancy? I promise you this debate has been around for decades, but in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Paizo actually took the time to say, yeah, that makes sense. And so a lot of magic got relabeled in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and now a lot of healing spells fall under the category of necromancy. And as a strange quirk of how this plays out, the cleric actually ends up being the class with the most options under the concept of necromancy inside the game. The arcane spell list, which is associated with wizards, is easily the largest spell list in the game. And if you played a wizard who was specialized in the necromancy school, over the course of your career, you would have approximately 19 spells from the core rulebook that were specifically labeled as necromancy spells. Not a bad selection. But if you look at the cleric in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, over the course of 20 levels, they actually have 40 different necromancy spells. Clerics have access to approximately 76% of all necromancy spells inside of the core rulebook. That is amazing. Now, for your clerics of the God of Valor, for instance, a lot of those necromancy spells are going to be healing or restorative magic of some kind. But for your darker priests, there are definitely going to be some zombie-related options that you can find as well. If you are interested in playing a character who deals in the magic of life and death, Cleric truly is the class for you. They have more options than any other class inside of the game. In fact, one of their major class features is defined by two spells from the Necromancy School. That is the Divine Font feature. Divine Font is a simple class feature that basically gives every cleric bonus spells, and these bonus spells can be one of two different spells, either heal or harm. Each deity will give you one of these two spells as bonus spells, and you get a number of bonus spells equal to 1 plus your charisma modifier. So for a first level character, you're probably going to be talking about 1 to 3 extra spells each adventuring day that are either the heal spell or the harm spell. And let me just go ahead and say, this is an incredibly powerful class feature. Think about this for a second. At level 1, you can potentially double the number of spell slots that you have per day or more and fill them with one of the most important spells for you as a cleric. You either have a heal spell, which you can use to keep you and your allies alive, or you have the harm spell, which you can use to damage your opponents. And the best thing about Divine Font is these bonus spells level up. As you gain access to more powerful spell levels, your heals and your harms from Divine Font will automatically scale to the highest level spell you can cast. So at level 20, you're looking at a potential 6 extra level 10 spells of your most frequently used spell. That's really, really good. Eat your heart out, Specialist Wizard. You can definitely say that the Path of the Healer is a strong option for the Pathfinder 2nd Edition Cleric, but the Harm spell means that there are some offensive options for the Cleric too. And before we leave Divine Font, I just want to talk about for a second, Heal and Harm are unique spells in Pathfinder 2nd Edition in that they have a variable number of actions that can be used when you cast those spells. Most spells require 2 actions to use, but Heal and Harm actually have a 1 action variant, 2 action variant, and 3 action variant, which are basically a touch version of the spell, a ranged version of the spell, and an area of effect version of the spell. That's a lot of flexibility packed into a single spell, and you have a class feature that is giving you multiple uses of a very flexible spell. This is really, really amazing. And on top of that, because you have these free versions of your main spell, that opens up your other spell slots to use other more interesting divine magic. You don't have to make a choice between, do I want to prepare Shield Other or Heal? Now you can put Shield Other in your main spell slot and you still have the heals you need to keep your party going. So that means in addition to these multiple uses of Heal or Harm, you end up with a class that has a lot of spell slots available for party buffs and party defense. One of the strengths of the Cleric class is they are really good at making the team stronger. Clerics are one of the best team players in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. True story from my own gaming table. A few weeks ago, I was running an encounter that was labeled a boss fight. This was supposed to be a hard fight, and in the first round of that encounter, the monsters that I was controlling managed to land 2 critical hits and 2 other regular hits against one of the party members. You would think that it would be looking bad for my party in that boss fight, but I'll go ahead and tell you, at the end of round 1, I knew that my party was going to cakewalk that encounter, and the reason I knew that my party was going to have such an easy time is the Cleric had dropped a perfectly placed Shield Other spell on the character who absorbed those 2 critical hits. I very quickly realized that defensive spell from my party's Cleric made the critical hits I was landing almost useless in that fight. Clerics can throw out some incredible defensive magic. One last thing I want to say about the strengths of the Cleric is they are notoriously good at battling undead, and depending on the options you take inside of the game, they can also be really strong when you're battling creatures from other planes. So if you're battling fiends or celestials or something like that, Clerics can often bring a lot to the table against those kinds of creatures as well. So if you are anticipating a game where the DM is going to be throwing hordes of undead, or where you're going to be battling evil fiends from other planes, Cleric can bring a lot of punch to your table. But now that we've talked about the strengths of the Cleric, let's move on to the weaknesses. What are some of the downsides of playing the Cleric? The first thing that I would like to talk about is action economy. This is something that you'll actually see with most spellcasters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Most spells require 2 actions, and you have a 3-action economy, which means most of the time when you are casting spells, you're using up 2 of your 3 actions in a given turn. Now, as I related with my story earlier, a well-timed spell is extremely powerful and can swing the course of an encounter. But there's a flip side to that. A poorly timed spell or a poorly placed spell can really feel like a dud. If a fighter misses on his first attack, he still has 2 more actions where he can try to deal some damage or can try to do something that's going to swing the encounter. If a cleric misses with their spell, that round's kind of out the window. Spellcasting can be a high-risk, high-reward scenario inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and so just be aware that if you are playing a spellcaster of any type, but this applies to the cleric, that your action economy becomes a little bit riskier because so much of your power is tied up into spellcasting. Now I will say Pathfinder 2nd Edition has done some things to kind of negate what used to be known as save or suck in role-playing games. So it's not as bad as it used to be, but you can still easily waste a round as a cleric if a spell fizzles for one reason or another. But that's not the only thing harming the cleric action economy. Clerics are one of the worst classes in the game when it comes to reactions. Most classes will come with some kind of reaction that is available to them that they can use during the course of play, but the truth is clerics get very few reactions, and the reactions that they do get are very situational. In the core rulebook, the only reaction available to a cleric is the shield block reaction, which is available only to the war priest subclass of the cleric. There are no other reactions for clerics in the core rulebook. You have to go to the Advanced Player's Guide, and in the Advanced Player's Guide, you kind of have 3 options available. Now I will say the rapid response reaction from the Advanced Player's Guide, that is a fantastic cleric reaction. If one of your allies drops to 0, you get a reaction to move 10 feet towards them, and that makes it a lot more likely that you're going to drop a life-saving heal to bring your party member back into the fight. So I like rapid response, but as a big picture look at cleric reactions, they're powerful when you get to use them, and you're probably not going to use them very often. As such, clerics really feel left out when it comes to having decent reactions available to them inside the game. The next major weakness of the cleric is skills. Clerics begin the game trained in religion and 1 skill determined by their deity, then 2 more skills of their choice plus their intelligence modifier, and then they'll also probably get 1 skill and a lore from their background. And that's a decent base to build from, but clerics kind of run into the problem of intelligence is probably your dump stat. Especially if you're playing a war priest cleric, intelligence is very likely to be one of the lowest stats for your character, which means that you're going to be sitting on just those base skills that come from your class and from your background. And the reality is, religion is defined by the fact that you're a cleric. One of your skills plus your lore skill is going to be defined by your background, and then one of your skills is going to be defined by the choice of deity that you went with. So that really leaves you with only 2 skills that you get to pick on your own. And for a cleric, there's a very strong argument that those skills have already been picked for you. If you're the party healer, and if you're playing a good cleric, there's a strong chance you are, you probably want the medicine skill, and because Divine Font runs on charisma, you probably want a charisma skill, which is more than likely going to end up being diplomacy. So there is a very real possibility that as a cleric, you're going to end up in a situation where most, if not all, of your skill picks are done before you ever really get to look at anything else. It's not as bad for the cloistered cleric. They usually have a little bit better intelligence compared to the war priest, but clerics suffer in the skill department because they don't get a lot of skill picks, and a lot of their skill picks are already kind of pigeonholed for the class. This also touches on another weakness that you run into with the cleric, especially with the war priest cleric, which is MAD, or multiple attribute dependency. Clerics can easily end up in a situation where they are hungry for lots of different stats in order to be effective. As a cleric, your spells run off of wisdom, so you want a good wisdom. And then your divine font runs off of charisma, so you want a good charisma. And if you decide to play a war priest, then you at the very least want a decent strength and constitution added on top of that, and a good dexterity doesn't hurt. But if you want skills, intelligence is a need as well. It is really easy to wind up in a situation where a cleric, especially a war priest, is going to see their attributes pulled in several different directions, and they run the risk of becoming ineffective if they don't manage that multiple attribute dependency well. Now, this video series is mostly aimed at new players, and multiple attribute dependency and the right way to build war priest clerics is kind of a deep dive. So what I would like to do here is I would actually like to recommend another video on YouTube. There's a guy by the name of Crunch McDabbles who has done a deep dive into the war priest cleric and has actually taken on the question, should clerics just dump wisdom if they want to play a war priest? It's a really interesting discussion. It's a little bit deeper than maybe most new players would want to go for. But if you want to see a cool take on this particular problem, I highly recommend his video, and I'll be throwing a link up here and down in the description, and I really strongly encourage you to go check him out. Now, there is another weakness of the cleric that probably should be apparent from the conversations we've been having so far, but I do want to go ahead and spell this out just so you are aware of it, and that is clerics are not very strong when it comes to offensive magic. Now, we've already defined the cleric spellcasting as a defensive focused class, so again, that shouldn't be a huge surprise, but just be aware of the fact that the spell selection for clerics when it comes to offensive spells is going to be limited. Now, on the positive here, clerics do have access to the harm spell, and as we've mentioned, that's one of those unique spells that has a 1, 2, or 3 action variant, so there's a lot of flexibility with the harm spell, and that is good, but outside of the harm spell, you will find that offensive spells for the cleric are somewhat limited. A good example of this is one of the primary cleric attack cantrips, the Divine Lance spell. Divine Lance deals alignment damage, and if you study the rules for alignment damage, you quickly realize alignment damage only works against certain targets. Which means one of the main cleric cantrips that can be used over and over again in an offensive fashion is going to be completely dead in the water against certain opponents. Now, there are exceptions here, as we've mentioned elsewhere, when it comes to battling undead, when it comes to battling fiends or celestials, things like that. Clerics are going to have some really fantastic options, so they're not completely devoid of offensive options, but just be aware that if you play a cleric, you are focusing more on defense, more on strengthening your party than you are actually attacking the enemies ahead of you, and don't let that disparity in the spells available come as a surprise. There is also another weakness of the cleric that this is probably going to be a personal opinion thing, but I do want to go ahead and state this. In the core rulebook for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the cleric is a little bit flavorless, if you ask me. Especially compared to Pathfinder 1st Edition, where the cleric had a lot of engaging and flavorful choices that were readily apparent from the get-go with the class. The class in 2nd Edition ends up feeling a little stale, a little dry, and you're going to want to do some work to really flesh out your character well. Now, the good news on this is the background portion of character creation can really help you flesh out your cleric in a meaningful way. So there are ways to build a well-rounded cleric in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but the class in and of itself ends up being one of the drier classes inside of the game. So now that we've talked about the weaknesses of the cleric, let's move on to question number 4, which is, what are the build options for the cleric? And really right now, we got 2 things to talk about: the War Priest and the Cloistered Cleric. Hashtag Paizo, give us the Inquisitor subclass now. Not gonna lie, I am one of those people that is really ready for Paizo to give us a new subclass for the cleric. I want to see the Inquisitor or something like it added to the cleric, and I really hope Secrets of Magic gives us some new options for the cleric. But right now, there are 2 basic variations of the cleric. One of them is the Cloistered Cleric, and one of them is the War Priest. The Cloistered Cleric is the heavy spellcasting focus version of the cleric. This is the version of the cleric that is going to start with access to domain focus spells from their deity, and then over the course of their character progression, they will achieve legendary proficiency with their spells. The Cloistered Cleric is just all in on divine spellcasting. They don't use armor, and their weapon selection is very limited. But when it comes to magic, the Cloistered Cleric has it all. On the other hand, you have the War Priest, and the War Priest slows down the spellcasting progression to give the cleric more options when it comes to actually being in combat. So the War Priest is going to get light armor and medium armor proficiency, it's going to get a wider range of weapons, and it's going to get access to expert proficiency in weapons earlier than the Cloistered Cleric would. But ultimately, the War Priest is going to cap out at master proficiency on its spellcasting. So basically, the War Priest you can think of as trading a little bit of spell ability to give some more versatility in terms of what they can do in combat. But in examining the War Priest, you have to be careful, because I want you to notice the War Priest achieves master proficiency with magic and only expert proficiency with weapons and armor. The War Priest is still a caster. Yes, it is a caster that can go into melee and have more options in melee, but even in melee combat, the War Priest is still probably going to be more of a support character than it would be a true melee combatant. Both the Cloistered Cleric and the War Priest get up to 10th level spells. Both of them have a full spell progression, so both of these subclasses are still casting subclasses. The real question is not, do I want to be a caster or a melee fighter? It's, do I want to be an all-in caster, or do I want to be mostly a caster with some combat options? Now, this part is entirely personal opinion, so don't take this to the bank, but for me personally, the War Priest feels really good from levels 1 to 10, and then after level 10, I don't like the War Priest as much. It's really strong early game, but it kind of feels like the trade-offs on spellcasting begin to hamper it later. Other people may have had a better experience. For long-term campaigns, I prefer the Cloistered Cleric, but for low-level campaigns, either of them can be very effective. Again, that's personal opinion. Don't take that one to the bank. But those are the 2 subclasses that you have access to as a cleric right now, and from there, the diversity of the class is ultimately going to be spell selection. And since diving into every spell inside of the game would take way too long, that means we get to move on to section number 5, how can I get the most out of the cleric at my gaming table? Now, before I dive into specific advice on how to get the most out of a cleric, There are a few products I want to show you that I have found to be helpful at my gaming table, and I just want to share them with you because if you're considering playing a cleric, these are products that I would encourage you to check out. First up is the Divine Spell Cards deck. This deck includes spell cards for all of the Divine Tradition spells in the Pathfinder core rulebook, and I've actually upgraded this collection where I've got all of the Advanced Player Guide spells in here as well. But I actually give this deck to my player who plays a cleric, and they use these spell cards in play, and we have found these references to be fantastic. It saves a lot of time, my player doesn't have to dig into the books, but it also just makes it easier for them to quickly compare spells when they're trying to decide what do I want to prepare. So if you are considering playing a cleric for a significant length of time, this is a pretty good product. Also, earlier I mentioned that the core rulebook for Pathfinder 2nd Edition really doesn't have a lot of flavor for the cleric, but there are some books that you can reference if you want to get some good flavor for the characters that you might consider playing. For Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there is Lost Omens, Gods, and Magic. This book offers a ton of details for the different deities and different faiths inside the Golarion campaign setting, and there's even some cool mechanical rules, and there's even some interesting religion skill feats that let you use the religion skill in ways that you normally wouldn't get to. There's just a lot of good crunch and flavor inside this book, and if you're planning on playing a cleric, I would try to take a look at this book and see the options that it presents you, because I think this goes a long way in helping you establish some flavor for a cleric that you might play. Another book that you might actually consider looking at is from Pathfinder 1st Edition, which is Inner Sea Gods. Now, there is mechanical stuff in this book, but it's all for Pathfinder 1st Edition, which means that the mechanical stuff in this book is not going to help you. At least not unless your GM is really willing to retool some things. But the flavor section of this book goes even deeper on the different faiths, religions, and deities inside of the Golarion campaign setting. So if you're really looking for some good flavor and you know someone who has some old Pathfinder 1st Edition books, I would check this book out because it'll probably give you a lot of inspiration when it comes to making a cleric inside your game. In fact, when it comes to the idea of flavor for a cleric, there are a lot of fantastic resources that you can check out to help you develop your character in interesting ways. Earlier, I talked about the real-world examples of clergy, and if you're trying to develop a cleric concept for your game, there are a lot of good examples in the real world that you can use for inspiration. The obvious examples would be things like pastors and priests, because those are the most prominent examples we think of when we consider clergy in our society. But there are other examples you can use for clerics as well. Jesuit educators, the compassionate work that a lot of nuns do, missionaries, chaplains. A really good example would be different religious nonprofits you might find in your community. All of these different sources can be good inspiration if you're developing a cleric. Since there's not a lot of flavor inside of the core rulebook, I encourage you to kind of look at famous examples of real-world clergy if you're struggling to develop a character concept that would be fun to play. But moving past flavor into the actual mechanics of the game, there are some things that you can do to get a lot out of your cleric in play, and the big thing that we need to talk about is spell selection. For a cleric, spell selection is going to be make or break to anything that you try to do. Use your spells well and you will feel powerful. You will feel impactful. Use your spells poorly and you're not going to have much fun at the gaming table. Now, there is a lot that goes into using your spells well. I have actually done a video on how to make spellcasters perform better in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I'll try to throw a link up here if you want to check that out. But spend some time seriously considering what spells you're going to use how your spells are going to impact the table and figure out how to get the most out of your spells. And for the cleric in specific, we've already noted you're a team player. So one of the best ways to do this is to talk to the other members of your group and find out what kind of magic is going to be the most helpful to them. If you're considering playing a cleric, don't just look at your spell list, but talk to your allies, find out what strategies they enjoy, find out what tactics they want to bring to the table, and then consider what spells you have that can improve those strategies and those tactics. This will obviously vary from table to table, game to game, even day to day. But good communication with your teammates is going to go a long way in determining how effective your spells are, and since spells are your make or break, it's definitely a conversation you want to have. On the subject of spells, there is an important thing that I want to point out real quick, which is you can prepare heal and harm spells in your regular spell slots. It's not a Divine Font only option for clerics. Divine Font is powerful and the spells in Divine Font are auto-leveled up, but if you want extra uses of a spell, or if you want the spell that you don't get for Divine Font, you can still use your regular spell slots for that. So if you're a cleric of Serenray, who automatically has several heal spells through your Divine Font, you can still prepare harm spells in your regular spell slots. On the flip side, if you're a cleric of Nagorber, and you have harm spells for your Divine Font, you can use heal spells in your regular spell slots, and in both cases, if you want more heal or harm spells, whichever the case may be, you can prepare them in your regular spell slots. So don't feel like heal and harm have to be contained to just your Divine Font. Another major thing you want to think about when it comes to the cleric is the cleric class is very heavily focused on spellcasting. We've seen that several times through this video, and that means that diversifying your character is really something you want to think about when it comes to your non-cleric options. Your cleric feats are probably going to build on spellcasting directly or indirectly in some fashion, which means that the other choices that you make in-game are going to be a lot more impactful in terms of fleshing out what your character can do. As a simple example, we noted earlier that clerics are often really limited when it comes to skills. Well, every single ancestry inside the game has an ancestry feat that gives you like 2 extra skills and an extra lore. If your cleric is really struggling on the skills front, then it may be a good idea to take one of your ancestry feats and pick up some of those extra skills. Another strong recommendation that I would like to give is the Canny Acumen feat. Canny Acumen is a general feat that basically allows you to buff up a weaker area of your class. And for cleric, I strongly recommend Canny Acumen Perception. This will give you, at level 17, master proficiency with perception, and since wisdom is your key ability score, you actually end up with a really strong perception modifier as a result. It is very easy for high-level clerics who use Canny Acumen to get their perception DCs up above 40, which is really strong. So that is definitely a recommendation I would throw out there, but just as a general rule, when it comes to ancestry feats, general feats, skill feats, actively look for ways to round out what your cleric is able to do. Your class is so heavily focused on spellcasting that these other choices are going to have a major impact on the flexibility of the character that you are playing. But there are 2 other things in this category that I want to talk about that are not exclusive to the cleric, but these are definitely areas where you have the opportunity to shine. And that is leadership and rituals. Now, if we take a step back and consider the cleric for a moment, you will quickly realize that cleric is one of the classes that has a surprising amount of social weight to the class. You are a representative of your faith. You are a speaker for your deity. There's actually a level 20 cleric feat that is just people instinctively know that when you talk, you are speaking for your deity, and there's all kinds of benefits that come with that. Your role in the campaign world is one that comes with a lot of social clout. Think about how much impact clergy have in the real world. Weddings, funerals, baptisms, these are all incredibly important rituals that mean a lot to the people who participate in them, and people often go to clergy for support in major life decisions. The role of a cleric in their community is an incredibly important role of social leadership, and that's going to be true inside of the campaign world as well. If you are playing a cleric, you are playing a leader. Now, the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition actually has a leadership subsystem that lays out some specific rules for building an organization, and that is definitely something you can do as a cleric. So don't be afraid to ask your storyteller to take a look at those rules, but just as a general rule, pause and think about what it means for your character to be a representative of the faith, for them to be a leader in their community, and ask yourself, how can I build off of this concept of leadership? By the way, mechanically speaking, cleric is actually one of the better defensive social classes in the game. They have a good wisdom score. They have a good charisma score. These two scores have an oversized influence on your ability to pierce deception, to persuade people to your particular point of view. Clerics are, mechanically speaking, surprisingly well positioned as negotiators inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and it would be very easy for you to take that role for your party, especially if you don't have a class like a bard that is more focused on that role. If you're going to play a cleric, I strongly encourage you to think about how you can be a leader for your party, for the community inside of the game world. I guarantee you, you can get a lot of mileage out of using these elements inside the game. Also, speaking of weddings, funerals, baptisms, let's talk for a moment about rituals. This is something that was done first in D&D 5th edition, and Pathfinder 2nd edition has picked this concept up, and I really enjoy it. It's the idea that not all magic is necessarily the spell slots that casters sling around during a fight, that there is a category of magic known as ritual magic. It is magic that has a higher investment cost in terms of time and material and energy, and may even require multiple participants in order for the magic to be effective. Pathfinder 2nd edition has included multiple ritual spells that you can use inside of the game, and it's an element of the game that is easy to overlook, that can be truly impactful, and as a cleric, you are well positioned to take advantage of ritual spells. Here are 4 easy examples: Atone, Consecrate, Planar Ally, Resurrection. All 4 of those spells can have a potent impact on your game, and all 4 of those spells are well positioned inside the themes of the cleric. These are things that your party would reasonably expect you to bring to the table, and it's definitely something you want to consider. Ritual magic is not limited to the cleric, but it is an area where the cleric has a lot of potential to shine, and where the cleric has a lot of potential to really help their party succeed in ways that you might not normally think of inside of the game. So if you're playing a cleric, take some time to study the ritual spellcasting rules, and you may find some really interesting and impactful options for gameplay. So I know that that has been a ton of information, so I'm going to go ahead and leave the conversation here, but let me throw it over to you. What are your thoughts on the cleric? Are there strengths of the class that I overlooked? Are there weaknesses of the class that I failed to mention? And do you have suggestions on how players can get the most out of a cleric at their gaming table? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. Next time, we're going to finish off the core 4 classic character concepts. We're going to be looking at the Wizard in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and I am excited to dive into what is historically my favorite class in fantasy RPGs. But after we get done with the Wizard, the options are going to be wide open, so feel free to let me know what classes you are interested in me discussing as part of this series. Let me know if there's a particular class you would like me to consider once we get done with the Wizard. Also, if you enjoyed this video, like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, be a part of the conversation that we have ongoing. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a wonderful day.